Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to part 2 of our Reaper tutorial. Today we're going to be talking about something that's rather complicated in some ways, but needs to be talked about early on because this is something that I think will define the way that you work with audio. You may already be familiar with a lot of this stuff depending on how far down the audio road you've gone, but I'll be showing you how to do a lot of this stuff in the context of Reaper, and that is routing. Routing audio, because let's say from the basic tutorial that we did for the 101 that you've already recorded everything. Now you're going to go ahead and mix it. Now, one of the most important things, EQ aside, compression aside, and all that kind of stuff, you have to make sure that all your separate pieces of audio blend well, go together, and that you can keep it organized, keep a track of it, and deal with it efficiently. And that's why back in the mid-70s, mixing desks started having these things called groups. And right from the start, they also had things like auxiliary sends, which is where you can send some of a particular sound, let's say, for example, a snare drum, out to another sound source, that is to say something like a reverb unit. Or you might want to have, 5 or 10 or 20 different drum microphones, and you might want to be able to just listen to all of that together and maybe process all of that together. So maybe say put a compressor on all the drums, not one compressor on each drum, but one that affects everything all at once. That is done with routing, where you tell Pro Tools or Logic or Reaper or an analog mixing desk or whatever it is, you tell it this audio has to start here and go through here to get to the end. And it's a very important concept that will really help you take your mixes from bedroom demo to world class. I mean, it's one of those things where I would go so far as to say that if you don't understand routing through and through, then perhaps you're not ready as a mix engineer. I mean, it's that big a deal. If you understand how to do complex routing and you still decide, no, I want to do this the simple way, fine. But I think understanding how this works is crucial to being a modern mix engineer. So without further ado, let's switch the screen over to my copy of Reaper. So for the time being, you see these effects here, just kind of ignore those. We'll talk about those later. Now, this is a track of mine that you'll have heard in the background quite a lot. This is a track, I'll just play you a little bit of it. Let's turn it down a bit. So what you can see here is you can see the kick drum, the snare drum, hi-hats, toms, overheads, room microphones. There's 2 channels of bass because one's clean, one's distorted, and this is one way to do it, is just record everything on 2 separate channels. But again, this is something we're going to talk about in routing, is you don't have to do that. And then there's the left guitar and the right guitar, which if you look at the pan knobs, have been put all the way left and all the way right. And at the end, we've got room reverb and a plate reverb. Now, looking at them, I've not actually put the reverbs in there, so I'm quickly going to go ahead and we'll talk about effects on another day. But in this case, I'm just going to throw on a Slate Verb Suite Classic for the room using the Bricasti M7, and I'm going to use a Lexicon snare plate for the plate reverb. I'll probably need to turn those down a little. Whoa, that was loud. But that should, now if I hit play, still sound dry. Now here's one of the first lessons of routing, is something called sends. I've put 2 different reverbs on 2 channels right at the end here, and yet nothing's happening. Why is nothing happening? Nothing's happening because we've not told Reaper yet this sound needs to go to this channel, because as it stands, if we look at these little green boxes down here in Reaper, we can see, and this is a nice little new thing in Reaper 5, we can see a routing button that's got MRS, and M is lit up in green. M is for master, and what that means is this channel, as things are set, and as master is enabled by default for each track, but you can turn it off. The master means that this sound for this channel, say the snare channel, will come out of the master output, which usually, again, by default, you can change all of this, but by default, that's what you will hear through the speakers or through your headphones when you hit render at the end of the day. If you render out the master mix, that is what you will get in a file. So all of these tracks, as it's set, all come out of the master, so when I hit play, we hear all of them. And we can see the levels on the master going because every track is going through. Now, if I solo the room reverb and the plate reverb, there's absolutely nothing happening because we've not told anything to go there. So what we do is if I click on the routing button for the snare, it'll pop me up a little window. Now, this is a very powerful window because, as I said before, there's no such thing in Reaper as, say, instrument tracks or MIDI tracks or audio tracks or aux tracks, bus tracks, any of that crap. There's just tracks. And that's it. So this snare is currently a stereo track. It just so happens to be that way because this is actually a bounce of a virtual drum kit. Just for the purposes of this demo, it doesn't make any difference. That's another interesting thing about Reaper where routing is concerned, is that by default, everything works in stereo. I mean, hey, you've got two speakers, so let's say you had a mono snare or a mono kick. You send that to something stereo. You don't need any of these awful mono to stereo plugins or anything like that. It just works. It comes out of both speakers, comes out of both channels left and right equally. Done. Great. One of the things that saves me a lot of time because that's the kind of thing that I would expect in a modern mix system. Anywho, moving on, going back to the routing window, there's a little tick box at the top which is master send. If I untick that, the only snare we can hear now is actually coming out of the overheads in the room microphone. See, if I solo the snare, nothing happens. Or at least we don't hear anything. We can still see the meter going though. You can see the snare going bang, bang. Because that channel's still active. It's not been muted. It's just we've told it we don't want to hear that out of the master output. That can be quite useful. It can be useful for a number of reasons. Now, in the meantime, we'll come back to that in a minute. But let's look in here again. So there's the volume here, there's the pan. There's also a little width thing, so if you decide you want to narrow a track down to mono or even flip the left and right, there's a nice little slider there. You can make this have more channels. You can make the snare have 4 channels, 6 channels, anywhere up to 64 channels. I'm not sure why you'd need that many, but I'll show you an instance later where I use quite a lot of channels on the same track. In the meantime, if this had MIDI on this channel, you can send the MIDI out of a hardware output, and you can choose which channel it's going from right there, just at the click of a button. Now, audio hardware outputs. Right now, this is giving me a choice of analog 1 and 2, and then analog options separately. That's because I'm using an Audient ID4, which is a fantastic little interface for me to use at home. But it's only 2 channels in, 2 channels out. If I had, say, an 8-channel interface, or say at my studio I've got 32 in, 32 out interface, they all come up here as a big, great list. Now, why would I do that? There are so many reasons that this is a great little shortcut, because if I was to add that, I can add another one, and another one where, say in Pro Tools, you choose what output a channel goes to. Here I can choose as many outputs as I want, which is great because then I can build separate mixes for people. Let's say I'm in the studio and I've got 30 channels going, all drums, bass, guitars, everything, and the drummer asks me, oh, can you turn this up in my headphones? Can you turn that up in my headphones? If I decide, nah, it might be arbitrary, but let's say outputs 3 and 4 are the headphones for the drummer, 5 and 6 might be the outputs for the guitarist, 7 and 8 might be for the bass player, on and on and on and on. I can add them all in here, and you can see if I look just behind it, just down here, they've popped up as little sliders. And it actually tells me what they are as well. So I can just go bit less, bit more, bit less, bit more without leaving the mix window. And I use this all the time. For efficiency's sake, a lot of sessions that I do, I'll only run one monitor mix out to the live room and one separately for me. If it's a big session, I can have as many outputs as I need through separate headphone amps. But I keep it simple most of the time because it's a lot of messing about and a lot of time wasted. Anyway, my arbitrary headphone out is usually channels 7 and 8. So what I tend to do is on the master, just underneath where it says analog 1 and 2, if I click in here, that also brings up the same routing window for the master track. And I can add a hardware output. So I might add 7 and 8 in there. And then if everybody says, oh, the headphones are too loud, I can then turn that down separately of the entire mix for me in the control room. So if they then say, oh, can I have extra click in the headphones or in the PA system in the live room, I can then find the click channel, because yeah, you can make a separate click channel in Reaper. And then I can just go routing, add a hardware output 7 and 8, and that will stack on top of the master output. So then I can have a lot of click going in there. Or alternatively, I could have each output separately like this. Oh, that's a nice little shortcut, by the way, in Reaper. If I just grab a send, I can drag and drop it in another channel, and it will just duplicate. Oh, and if I alt-click them, same on Mac, I'm on a PC, but it's all the same, they disappear. If I shift-click them, that bypasses them but doesn't get rid of them, so I can just turn them off but have all the levels set so that if the singer or drummer change their mind or whatever and go, oh, can I hear that again, I can just go click and they can hear it again, and it doesn't affect what I'm hearing in the other room. So let's go back to here. That was hardware outputs. That is literal physical audio outputs on your interface, which is completely separate from this list just above it, which is sends, which, as you can see here, is a list of all the tracks that are going on, apart from there's one missing, and that's the same track we're already on. You don't want to send, say, the snare to the snare. That would just cause a horrible feedback loop. Although, typical Reaper, if you go into the settings and find the advanced stuff, you can actually turn that back on. So if you're crazy enough that you want to actually make feedback loops, that's all possible, but that's not in the realm of a usual sane person. Now, so if I go add new send for the snare, go down the list until I find plate reverb and just click, that's going to add me a plate reverb. I can choose the little drop down here, whether it's pre-fader, post-fader, or pre-effects, which is really quite a clever little addition that it's not just pre-fader, it's pre-everything. Now, that's something I'll come back to later again, but if I want this to be post-fader, what that means is if I want more snare, I'll also get a bit more of that reverb coming through. If I want less snare, the reverb will match. If I go pre-fader, so if I change that to pre-fader, no matter how much, so if I just hit play, I can drag the snare volume all the way down or all the way up, and it won't change the amount of reverb that's being sent. Now, if I put that back on post-fader, I'll just do a bit of a demo here. So if I turn the snare, you hear how that reverb's going down, or right. Generally speaking, post-fader is probably what you want if you're doing something like like a reverb send, where you want it to be a relative volume to the actual instrument. Because that way, if you decide halfway through your mix that you want a bit less of that instrument, the kind of reverb or whatever delay or whatever it is that you've made, you'll usually have decided that it's a certain kind of set percentage. So it's all relative. So if you want a bit less snare, you don't want the reverb level to be the same, because it'll just knock everything out of balance. So that's very important. What else have we got? So in here we can see the volume. We can actually see a number in terms of decibels, which if I hover over the send that's in the mix window, it actually tells me on the hover over as well, which is nice. If it was a MIDI track, then we can pick which of the channels go where. So that can get really quite complicated. Or the audio inside here can go from 1 and 2, which is usually kind of your main audio, to one particular, or you can add more channels for things like side chaining, which is where it can get quite crazy, and that's another thing for a more advanced topic. But the possibilities are all in this routing window. Now, when I talked about the MRS, the tiny little icons here, now that we've sent to the plate reverb, the little S has lit up. Now, the one that's not lit up is the one that we should talk about here, which is a great feature of Reaper, and that is the receives. Now, every time you send a send from a track, that has to go somewhere, and wherever it goes, that's called the receive. Send and receive. It's kind of like a walkie-talkie kind of thing. So if we look over at the reverb, which is on the far side here, the R has now lit up in yellow because that's now receiving. If I click the routing for that, you can see it's under the receives. It's coming from the snare. And as I move the volume up and down, if I move the receive volume, they're linked. So if you see me sliding that on the right, if you look over on the left at this, you'll see that move, and they move together. Now, that's quite a useful thing, because let's say the snare's going to that reverb, but then so's a bit of the distorted bass, and so's some of the guitar. That can, if you prefer looking at it like this, which I do, I prefer looking at this like an analog desk with all the kind of aux send knobs there, then great. But if you want to just open up the routing window, I can see a list here of every track that's being sent to this reverb and how much of it is being sent. So let's say I've got a complex mix with 100 tracks or more. It starts to get really confusing as to what's going where. But if I just open up the routing window on, say, this reverb, I can see these tracks have a little bit of themselves being sent here, or a lot, depending on how much you want to send. And this is how much is being sent. And that can make things nice and easy to read, because that means that no matter what, that's now easy. So if I hit play now, we should get a on the reverb. And we can hear that reverb now has things being sent to it, namely the snare, the distortion on the bass, and the two guitars. If I take those guitars away with the alt click, the only thing that's left is that snare, which is going. So that's routing in terms of sends and receives. Now, the next thing is the way that everyone thought about mixing in the 70s is, let's say you've got a 24-track tape. So you've got a kick, a snare, toms, overheads, yada, yada, yada. You'd probably want, when you've got the balance right for those, you might want to pull the amount of drums that you have round. You might not want to get your hands and just move all that. If you did, here's a great trick in Reaper. So this works both in the edit window and the mix window, but it's much easier to see down here in the edit window. If I wanted to change, you see how these levels on the kick, snare, hats, they're all slightly different from each other. if I want to add a bit of volume to all of these, or I'd say just some of these, let's just say I want to add the kick, I hold down the shift button and press and do a click on, say, the ambient. You see how they've all lit up? Or if I hit control, I think it's Apple on a Mac. But yeah, so if I select the ones that I want to select, I can now grab any of these faders and watch this. They all move relative to each other. So where, say, one was a few decibels above the others, now if I hit play while I do this, I can now move all of those. So let's say I want to move the amount of room reverb and original bass at the same time. It doesn't matter how many of these I select, they all move relative to each other, and it's a beautiful thing, because even after all the stuff we're going to talk about next with all the grouping and all the clever routing you can do, sometimes you just want to go, I need more of this vocal, and this guitar, and I can just go that one, and just push them. And the level balance between them all doesn't change. They all just get equally more or equally less, and it's a beautiful little trick. I'm sure there are other DAWs that do that, but I've not seen one this simple. There's a reason that Reaper stands for Rapid Environment for Audio Production, because it makes things so much quicker. Now, the other thing I was talking about is, what if I want to listen to all the drums? So if I just shift and click these, one thing I can do is if I hit solo, that then solos all of those, and that's great. But the next thing we want to do really is what I call group busing. Now, group busing, if you ever look at a really big mix console, you'll usually see that either in the middle or at the end, there's maybe 8 or 12 or 16, usually 8, faders just kind of in the middle, not connected to big banks of knobs and switches, just faders. And what they are your groups. So thinking about an analog kind of thing, you might have, 20 drum channels if you've got loads of room mics and a spot mic and everything, whatever. 20, 30, 50, 100, doesn't matter, you've got a lot. But what you would do is there's usually a routing button on an analog desk for each one that goes to the LR or master or main mix or 2-track or whatever, and you would unclick those so the sound isn't coming straight out of the speakers, and then you might click a button that says, say, 1 and 2, so there would be a separate channel called group 1 and 2. So what we'll do here is, if I just make a new track at the end and call this drum bus in nice capital letters, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to unclick the master send on the kick, unclick the master send on the snare, and I'm going to repeat this on the toms and the overheads and the ambience, exactly like I would on an analog desk, unclicking those routing things. Now, if I go back to the routing for the kick, if I go to send, add, send, drum bus, now that, instead of doing it on every channel, I'm just going to cheat. I'm just going to drag that and copy it. Like I said before, I'm going to copy that to every channel. Now if I hit play, this shouldn't sound any different to before. Difference is, you can see this channel's going crazy. If I solo the drum bus and hit play, you can see and you can hear all the drums are now coming through that one track. Now, why is that important? This means that life just became a lot easier. So let's say I've got a bass bus and a guitar bus. So let's do the same with those. And this is where later down the line with a mix, you can really start to make your own life easy. Because this new bass, if I go to send bass bus and just copy that over to the other bass channel, and then the same with these, if the guitars, if I go to the guitar bus and send. So now if I just solo the last 3 channels, that's all going really well. Now the room reverb and plate reverb, I'm just going to move them to the end so that I can see, because that's how I would work traditionally. I've changed my methods and we'll talk about that in a minute. But traditionally I would go kind of, drums, bass, guitar, maybe acoustic guitar, maybe guitar solos, maybe vocals, maybe backing vocals. And then I might even do the reverbs and delays and everything as a group bus called effects. And that's it, because that then means when I've spent hours upon hours, making sure that each separate instrument sounds as good as it can sound and has been edited properly, that then becomes, instead of 100 tracks, that's now 8 tracks. So if I'm listening and I go, because say I had the bass 2 channels here, I had different ones. If I just solo the bass bus, now I can just listen to the whole thing, whereas if I just solo one of them, or the other one, each one might sound not so good on its own. Same with the drums, but now I have the ability to balance them, and here's one of the big things. I can now put separate effects on, say, all the drums, or all the bass channels, or all the guitars. So things like a bit of tape saturation, or a clipper, or like a very light dusting of a magical EQ, or things you would do as broad, gentle kind of mojo brushstrokes rather than surgical correction. I would do like this. And this again goes back to the 70s and the 80s, where say you've got a stereo compressor that's absolutely fantastic that you want to put on the drums, but you can only afford one of them because they cost $5,000 each. So you would do all your separate work that you need to do on your separate drums, send them to, say, the drum group bus, and then do the magic on there. Same with any other channel. If I wanted to, say, brighten the guitars, I mean, there are 2 guitars here, so it looks a little bit pointless. But let's say I had 6 guitars or 8 guitars. Maybe I had a couple of little kind of extra lines and, quad-tracked guitars or whatever. Now I could just pull an EQ out and just EQ all the guitars together. And the other thing is, if you do group busing like this, especially with guitars where they have to be hard pan left and hard pan right, if I can just EQ them together and just do it once, that'll save me some CPU because I'm not putting 2 effects on, one for the left, one for the right. It'll save me some brain power because I can just open one EQ and I can see it right in front of me and I can do everything once, which of course that's much more efficient. That's half the time. If I do, I'm doing that on both of those guitars at once now, and I'm not having to think too hard about kind of, make sure that this channel matches that channel, copy paste these effects, make sure that I store everything. I can throw all that out the window and be kind of calm inside and quite kind of zen and focused, because I can just go, the guitars need more high end, one copy of an EQ, more high end, done, move on. Or whatever, or any permutation of any kind of mixed note that you might come up with, to be able to make it as simple as possible. It's not laziness, it's efficiency and it's clarity of mind, and it means that I can work faster, I can think clearer, I don't get bogged down so much in, kind of what they call losing your ear where you're working so hard that your objectivity goes. And I used to do that all the time. I used to get absolutely bogged down in doing hard work, and after 8 hours of doing all the hard work, I couldn't focus anymore, and the mix sounded terrible. If I can take that 8 hours down to 4 hours or 2 hours, then suddenly I get a much better quality of work, which means that I can then do 2 hours work, go and make myself a coffee, have a little break, come back, listen to it, maybe make a few changes, hit send it to the client. And I've saved myself a lot of pain. Now, this is a great way to work, and this is how I worked for quite a long time with the bus system. But I decided after a while that I should look into alternatives, because back when I was at university, I started on Cubase, and something that I always remembered about Cubase, although it was quite primitive and kind of didn't work very well at the time, but has come on a long way, was what's called the folder system. Where, I mean, it's something that you can do in Logic a bit, and I think it's like comping, but it's not quite as powerful as this. I mean, comping and takes and everything is something we're going to talk about in another video, but for today, I'm going to switch projects. Now I'm going to switch over to another version of this same project, and apart from that, you see the difference here? Oh, I'll just show and hide a couple of tracks. This is something you can do in Reaper for your own presence of mind. Now, this is exactly the same project that you just saw, except that this is done using folders. Now, I've not pre-rendered any of the drum audio here. This is doing some very clever stuff. So, you see here, the first track is called Drums. Then I've got a track called Drums Recording, which has probably got a bad name for it. But that's Stephen Slate drums, and you can see all these, if I just bring that up so you can see it, those are all sends. So this is not going out of the master, this is sending Stephen Slate drums, which if I look inside it, it's got 16 out of 24 possible outputs. And the stereo outputs, if we look at them, all the kicks are going to output 1, which is the kick. All the snares are going to output 2, which is a snare. Repeat, repeat, repeat. So there's hats, toms. So if I just solo the hats, now this looks quite a lot more complicated, and in terms of initial setup, there is more work involved. But I find, honestly, that the amount of extra work that I have to put into this to get this working properly is so little that the rewards are ridiculous. And the drums, now if I just solo that, that is what we call a folder. So all that's happened is the drums, which in this case is sending out to all these separate tracks. To make a folder, what you do, you make a new track, you put that above the tracks that you want to put into a folder, you shift and click the tracks that you want to go in the folder, and you drag them, and you see this blue line has appeared. So if I just drag these up until that blue line just goes in a little, you see this? It's quite a subtle distinction, but they go in, and if I let go there, suddenly they've gone in. They've gone indented a little bit. Now what's happening there is all the audio now comes through that folder. And that is an incredibly powerful tool, because that took, 3-4 seconds? So they're inside the drums folder. Now what's powerful here is, apart from this quite complicated routing for the drums, which I do so that I can mix it like a real drum kit, apart from that, which is a bit of an oddity, if you were recording a real drum kit, that wouldn't happen. These would still just be kick, snare, hats, toms, yada, yada, yada. Putting them in a folder, you don't need to untick the master audio sender, anything like that. Suddenly, all that audio kind of goes upwards and comes out here, comes out of this folder called drums. And that means that these effects that I've put on here, this slate tape and my mix rack, which I've just plopped on the folder there, they affect all the sound that comes through. Now, there's a nice little trick as well, which, so let's make a new channel and call this bass group. So, because there's 2 bass tracks here and they're not in a folder. So if I just shift and click them and move them up into that new thing, that won't affect the sound because nothing's changed. But if I solo that bass group folder that we made, suddenly that's all coming out of a single manageable routing kind of thing, which means that I can see all of the bass sound goes through this track, and if I want to, for whatever reason now, affect all the bass sound, I can just put an effect or a send, an insert or a send right there, or I can affect the volume level of the whole thing. And that works like the traditional groups, but it's more of an inline thing. Now, the same has happened with the rhythm group. So the rhythm guitars here, those are actually the clean DIs. And they're both being sent, hard left and hard right, out of the rhythm group, which then has a virtual guitar stereo amp. And I've got one single copy of the 808, one copy of the amp, one copy of the cab simulator. It's much more CPU efficient for a start, and it's much easier on my brain because I can deal with it all in one go. I mean, if this was recording real amps, then obviously I wouldn't be putting virtual amps on them, but I would still have them in folders because it helps me really narrow things down. You'll see me subfolder and subfolder and subfolder things. You'll especially see that when I'm doing things like these speaker demos that I've been doing, the Celestian Redback and Alnico Cream. Let's say I've got 2 microphones, SM57 and a 421, and I'm recording a guitar left and right. That's 4 channels. Let's say there's a clean guitar as well, so that's another 4 channels, so that's 8 channels, and there's a solo with 2 mics, so that's 10 channels per speaker combination. That's, if I've got 10 speaker combinations, that's 100 channels to deal with. That's awful. That's an absolute cluster of a project. But if I can folder everything, then suddenly I can just open and close folders and go, well, this was that speaker, this was that speaker, this was that speaker with these microphones in this combination. I can go, well, this is that speaker, this is the folder just for the distorted guitars, this is that speaker, this is the subfolder for the clean guitars, or whatever. I can just then look at it straight away. Let's see, I don't think I have that project with me. Let's just quickly, oh no, new tab. Oh, that's a new thing in Reaper, by the way, project tabs. I can have several things open at once. So let's just say, I don't know, let's call this Vintage 30. Now let's say this had 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 channels, and just for display's sake, let's just insert empty items. Oh. Can I do that? Let's just insert loads of stuff. So just so you get an idea of how horrible this looks. No, I don't want sub-projects. That's a new thing as well. There's a lot of new things recently. They're really making kind of leaps and bounds in terms of new features all the time, which kind of, it's not like new in Reaper 5 is this, that is. No, it's in 5.1 there's this, in 5.2 there's that, in 5.3 there's new stuff. There's constantly new features in Reaper, and it's absolutely fantastic. Right, so let's say we've got, so heavy 57 left. So that's heavy 57 left, heavy 41 left. See, this is, you can see how this is getting awful already. 57 right, heavy 41 right, clean 57 left, clean 41 left, clean 57 right. See, it's confusing just trying to write this out. Solo 57 and solo 41. So let's just throw one more MIDI item. Right. So this, without the folder, is an absolute mess, because this, how do you even mix this? So let's just go, those two go to the right. If I shift and click them, they go to the right, they go to the left, and they go to the right, and the solo goes down the middle. Great. Okay, but what if I want to put an effect on all the heavy guitars? So the first thing is, if I shift and click all of these, put these in that Vintage 30 folder, that's one thing. So say I had 10 different speakers, at least I could kind of, so you can see, let's just get rid of the mix window for a minute so you can see what's going on, and then red back. You see how suddenly that becomes easier to see than if they weren't all in folders. Now, let's say Vintage 30. This is how I work. So I would go Vintage 30 heavy. So they hard panned would be in a folder. So if I make another one that's Vintage 30 clean, it looks like I'm making more tracks, but because of the way I think about this, I'll show you another neat little trick in a second. And I'll go V30. I keep bashing that 9 key. Solo. Now suddenly, I'll just get rid of the examples. That looks more manageable to me straight away, because I can see that's my heavy channel. I can solo the heavy stuff. That's my clean. I can solo the clean stuff. That's my solo. I can solo the solo. Or I can solo the whole thing and not have to listen to all the other speakers going and go deaf. And then a nice little trick. You see these little down arrows here? Because these can get quite big, so you can see what's going on. If I click one of those, it shrinks everything down. If I click it again, it really shrinks down. So if there were, say I had 10 different speakers going, suddenly this mess with all those, so that was 56 tracks that we just made. But if I shrink them down like that, suddenly I can see one set. I can solo them, and then life is so much easier straight away. Because when it comes to rendering stems, this is another time that this will really help you. Because say I wanted to export my heavy, if I control and click or Apple and click on a Mac, the clean and the solo, so just those three are selected. If I then go to file and render, which is the equivalent of bounce in anything else, if I go to source, I can go to just tick stems, which is selected tracks. And then I can use the naming scheme. If I go, speaker, demo, and there's a wildcard system in this little button. If I just go click the $track, that will then name them. Where it says 3 files, it actually tells you what it's going to call them before you even hit render. So I can go, it will then name them for me. V3 heavy, V30 clean, V30 solo. If I want to then put version 1, that'll then name them that way. And so on and so on and so on. If I even want to date or timestamp it or anything, that's all in there. If I want to name it based on the project, the format, I bet sample rate's in there. Yeah, it is. So I can then name it as 48K wave, whatever it is that your naming system is that you've devised. It's all in there, and doing it with the foldering system, if you've named them properly in the project, your life has suddenly just become an absolute dream. I can then select, that's the time selection I want to export, that's my directory that I want to pick. I hit go, and it gives me the tracks that I need with all the effects on. And I am absolutely laughing, which is why when clients ask me, oh, can I get the stems for this track? I always go, yeah, give me 5 minutes. Where every other engineer goes, oh, stems? Oh, but that's such a complicated thing. And they end up having to charge extra money, which means unhappy clients. If you do it this way, then it's a much happier client. And therein lies the beauty of folders. One last little thing that I'll show you in the mix window is something that you have to enable. If I right click on any track in the mix window, where is it? Up here, there's a little button you have to enable, clickable icon for folder tracks to show and hide children. So you see a tick box, I've ticked it. Now, if I look at drums and the bass group and the rhythm group, there's these little buttons here. What I can do, I can collapse those down. So suddenly, the project has gone from this big sprawling mess to just drums, bass, rhythm, and looks a lot like we were talking about before with the, the group busing technique. So I can just have, when I'm near the end of a mix, and I don't want to get into specifics unless something really jumps out at me, I want to just be looking at final balancing, maybe a little bit of sprinkling magic fairy dust on the tracks. I can still do that here. And then halfway through that final mix, let's say there's a ping on the snare that really annoys me, that's just standing out now. If I just open the drums back up, there it would be, and I would just do what I was going to do before, and I've not had to then sift through hundreds of tracks to find where I'm at. I could just focus and just go drums, bass, rhythm guitars, vocals, reverbs, whatever, and then just keep it as simple and as streamlined as is mentally possible. So there's a lot that I've talked about there. Hopefully some of that's been of use to you and hasn't just been gibberish. I appreciate you watching, and we're going to talk about something else on another day very soon. Probably talking about effects next, because effects are kind of the whole hub center of going from a bedroom recording with proper routing to a release. So that's something where I'm probably going to talk about Reaper's stock effects and the VSTs and audio units that I use, or actually just VSTs in my case, inside Reaper, because it's a fully compatible VST host, which means that if your friend who uses Logic or Pro Tools goes, oh, I use these plugins, yeah, I use them too. So it's something else to look at. Just because I use a different flavour of ice cream doesn't mean that I can't use a spoon. It's a terrible analogy, but I'll keep that one for future use. So thank you for watching, and big thanks to our patrons on Patreon. If you've not helped us out on Patreon, please consider it, because that's the platform for crowdfunding that helps me to be able to do this pretty much for a living. I mean, I run the studio, and that keeps me very busy, but Patreon helps me to make the videos for you. So hit the subscribe button if you haven't done already, hit the like button because it's really appreciated, and stay tuned for more gear reviews, tutorials and whatnot. We'll see you very soon. I'm Adam Steele for the Hot Pole Studios. Thanks for watching. Good night.